A Werewolf Shifter Romance, written by Amelia Hart. Chapter 1. Ashes on the Wind. Salt stung the air as the people of Ironhold gathered on the frozen shore. The sea stretched gray beneath winter clouds. At the water's edge, a drakkar rocked gently on the waves. Its carved prow, shaped like a wolf's head, rose into the mist, awaiting its burden. Today, the beta of the kingdom, the only soul to ever cradle Astrid's heart without judgment, would journey to the gods. Astrid Bjornsdottir stood just beyond the huddled mourners, her black hair loose and wild beneath her fur hood. Snow clung to rich strands, melting against the pale skin of her cheeks. Her green eyes, so unlike the faded summer fields of her homeland, shone wide and haunted. She fixed them on the boat instead of the crowd, refusing to meet the glances she could feel grazing her form. The judgment, the distaste, the old cold whispers that had shadowed her for 22 years. They called her too much, too soft, too round, too different from the slender shield maidens who danced at harvest festivals. But her father's memory blanketed her like armor, thick as the furs that hung from her sturdy shoulders. He had loved her, fiercely and without question, and for that alone she let her numbed feet keep her upright as the funeral began. Her little brother Eric, only 8 winters old, clung to her side. His hand, small and cold as ice, curled into the fabric of her wool skirts. He tucked his face into her cloak whenever the wind howled or the chants of the mourners rose into the frosted air. Ingrid, their mother, lingered just behind them both. Her pale hair seemed sharper than the blade at her belt, her back as rigid as a sword's edge. Ingrid's hands trembled with impatience, not grief. She had never loved Bjorn the way a wife should love her husband. As the priest led the crowd in prayer to Odin, Astrid bowed her head, letting her hair form a silent shield around her face. She remembered strong arms catching her when she fell as a child, the way her father's laughter had always echoed louder than any taunt from cruel children. Now that steadiness was gone, lost to a fever that had taken him in 3 short days. Her heart pressed painfully under her ribs, struggling for space in a world that always seemed to shrink around her. The crowd parted as heavy footsteps approached. Warriors in furs and leather made way, their heads bowing respectfully. A hush fell like fresh snow. At the water's edge, their king, Ragnar Ironwolf, stepped forward, towering above even the burliest of his guards. At nearly 6 feet and 3 inches, Ragnar's strength was a landscape all its own. Shoulders broad as a blacksmith's anvil, arms corded with muscle beneath his thick wolfskin mantle, black hair falling in waves to his powerful neck, a full beard framing a jaw carved from granite. Eyes the pale ice of mountain streams swept the crowd once, unreadable and commanding. Beside the king, Fenrir stood. The wolf's pelt was silver gray, like morning mist rolling over stone. He prowled at Ragnar's side, as vigilant as any sentry in the storm. The beast was no ordinary wolf. Something ancient and knowing gleamed in his amber eyes, something that spoke of bloodlines stretching back to the first shifters who walked these lands. Astrid felt the king's gaze brush over her like winter wind, but she didn't look up, lost to private sorrow. Ragnar saw a girl apart from the others, silent, self-contained, holding a small boy close as if he were all that tethered her to this world. He noticed the way she fought tears, the way her hands clenched in the folds of her dark dress, not in vanity, but in aching loss. There was something in her stillness that drew his attention, something that whispered of depths unexplored. The priests raised their arms skyward, incanting ancient words in the old tongue. Their voices carried over the crash of waves against stone. The warriors nearest the ship drew back, longbows in their weathered hands. Astrid pressed Eric closer to her warmth, whispering comfort she didn't quite believe herself. Around her, old women keened their grief to the gray sky. Young men, pride swelling their necks like battle fury, stood with jaws set and eyes hard as flint. One arrow was touched to flame by the head priest. Ragnar himself stepped forward, taking the burning shaft with steady hands. The low crackle of fire battled the endless roar of the sea. He knocked the arrow, drawing the bowstring back with practiced ease, biceps bulging under thick leather bracers. In that moment, even the winter wind seemed to still, holding its breath for the sacred act. The flaming arrow soared through the gray air, burning bright as a fallen star, striking the oil-soaked hull with perfect aim. Flames leapt hungrily along the ship's sides. Thick smoke billowed black against slate clouds. The vessel, carrying all that remained of Astrid's beloved father, began its last journey, slipping slowly out past the jagged rocks into the churning, endless sea. People sang of glory and honor, of peace with the gods in the great halls beyond. Astrid remained silent, sorrow hanging heavy on her shoulders like a cloak of lead. Eric sobbed openly as the fire swallowed the only man who had ever held him when nightmares came calling. Ingrid's cold stare remained fixed on the dancing flames, her thin mouth pressed into a disapproving line. Emotions locked away behind walls of ice. The singing grew louder, warrior voices joining the priests in ancient hymns. Some mourners threw flowers into the waves, winter roses, pale as bone. Others cast small tokens, carved runes, silver coins, scraps of cloth that held the scent of the departed. Astrid had nothing to offer but her tears, and those she held back, knowing Ingrid's sharp tongue would find her later if she showed too much feeling. As the ship drifted further from shore, the chanting began to fade. The crowd started to shift, preparing to return to their warm halls and evening meals. Ingrid's voice reached Astrid's ear, low and biting as snake venom. "Try not to embarrass us more than you already have, Astrid, standing there like a mountain while decent women show proper grief. You draw enough unwanted attention as it is." Astrid flinched but said nothing, swallowing the hurt like bitter medicine. 100 memories swirled through her mind, her father's rough hand brushing snow from her rounded cheek, his voice booming in gentle mockery when others stared. "You are worth the world and more, little blackbird. Never forget that truth." He had never cared for the standards others imposed, never made her feel less than whole. The Wolf King handed his bow to a leather-clad retainer, but his ice-blue eyes found Astrid once more. He watched her struggle with sorrow, noted the way she shielded the boy from cruel winds and crueler words. Fenrir's gray ears twitched, the wolf's amber gaze following his master's interest. For a long moment, both king and beast studied the girl who stood apart, assessing something they could not yet name. The wind howled again across the water. Eric buried his face deeper into Astrid's woolen cloak, his small body shivering despite her efforts to warm him. "Can we go home now, sister?" he whispered, voice raw from weeping. "Soon, little one," Astrid murmured, pressing a kiss to his dark hair. "Father would want us to say a proper goodbye." Chapter 2. Teeth in the Snow. The mountain path twisted upward like a serpent's spine, carved into rock by generations of travelers seeking passage between Ironhold and the scattered villages beyond. Astrid pulled her fur cloak tighter as their wooden cart jolted over frozen stones, each bump sending sharp pains through her back. The horses snorted white breath into the bitter air, their hooves crunching through snow that had begun falling harder with each passing hour. Eric slept fitfully against her side, his small body trembling even beneath the thick woolen blankets she had wrapped around him. Dark circles shadowed his eyes. Grief had stolen his rest for 3 nights running. Astrid smoothed his black hair, so like her own, and whispered soft lullabies their father used to sing. The familiar words felt hollow in her throat, but they seemed to ease the boy's restless stirring. Ingrid sat rigid on the driver's bench, her pale hands gripping the reins with white knuckles. She had been silent since they left the coastal village, speaking only to complain about the weather or mutter sharp criticisms under her breath. "We should have departed at dawn," she hissed now, glancing at the darkening sky. "If we had not lingered so long at that cursed funeral, we would be safe in our own beds by now." "Father deserved proper mourning," Astrid replied quietly, not wanting to wake Eric, but unable to let the bitter words pass unchallenged. "The king himself honored him with fire and song. Would you have rushed past that blessing?" Ingrid's laugh was cold as winter wind. "The king noticed nothing beyond his own ceremony. And what good does honor do us now, trapped on this mountain as darkness falls?" She jerked the reins, urging the horses faster along the treacherous path. "Your sentiment will be the death of us all." Astrid bit back her response, knowing argument would only make their journey more miserable. Instead, she focused on the landscape around them. Ancient pines heavy with snow, rocky outcroppings that jutted from the mountainside like giants' teeth, the narrow path that wound ever higher toward the pass. This route had been traveled safely for decades. Bandits rarely ventured this far into the bitter cold, and wild beasts knew to avoid the scent of iron weapons and burning torches. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the very air seemed to hold its breath. The snow began falling harder, fat flakes that caught in Astrid's dark hair and melted against her cheeks. Within moments, visibility dropped to mere yards ahead of their cart. The horses whickered nervously, ears flicking back and forth as they strained to see through the white curtain descending around them. "We should stop," Astrid called over the rising wind. "Find shelter until this passes." "Absolutely not," Ingrid snapped. "I will not spend a night freezing in some cave because you lack the courage to press forward. We are barely 2 hours from home." Astrid studied the swirling snow with growing unease. Something felt wrong. Not just the weather, but something deeper. The horses sensed it too, their steps becoming more hesitant despite Ingrid's sharp commands. They tossed their heads and rolled their eyes, nostrils flaring as they tested the air for scents that made them afraid. Then Astrid saw the tracks. They were pressed deep into the snow beside the path, far too large for any normal wolf. The paw prints were nearly the size of dinner plates, with claw marks that gouged the frozen earth. Worse still, they seemed to follow the cart's route, paralleling their journey up the mountain. "Mother," Astrid began, but her words were cut off by a sound that turned her blood to ice. A howl echoed from somewhere in the white darkness. Long, mournful, and far too close. It was answered by another from the opposite side of the path, then another from somewhere ahead. The horses screamed in terror, rearing up and nearly overturning the cart before Ingrid fought them back under control. Eric jerked awake, his green eyes wide with fear. "What was that, Astrid? What's happening?" Before she could answer, shapes began emerging from the swirling snow. Wolves, but not like any wolves Astrid had ever seen. These beasts were massive, their shoulders reaching nearly to a man's chest. Their eyes glowed amber in the dim light, filled with an intelligence that made Astrid's skin crawl. These were not ordinary predators hunting for food. There was purpose in their movements, coordination in the way they surrounded the cart. "Shifters," Astrid breathed, the word barely audible above the wind. She had heard tales but never believed them. Men who could take the form of beasts, who walked between two worlds with power beyond human understanding. The largest of the wolves stepped onto the path directly ahead of them. Its coat was black as midnight, scarred from countless battles. When it opened its massive jaws, teeth like daggers gleamed white against the darkness of its throat. The beast's amber eyes fixed on the cart with predatory focus, and Astrid knew with terrible certainty that this was no chance encounter. "Run," she whispered to Ingrid. "We have to run now." Ingrid needed no further encouragement. She cracked the whip over the horses' backs, sending them bolting forward in blind panic. The cart lurched and bucked over the uneven ground, wheels spinning dangerously close to the cliff's edge. Behind them, howls rose in a terrible chorus as the pack gave chase. Astrid clutched Eric against her chest, trying to shield him from the worst of the bouncing, while keeping watch for their pursuers. The wolves ran alongside the cart with ease, their powerful legs eating up ground that the horses struggled to cross. They were playing with their prey, she realized. They could have overtaken the cart at any moment. "There!" Ingrid pointed ahead through the snow. "The old watchtower. If we can reach it." Her words were lost as one of the wolves leaped onto the back of the cart. Its claws scraped against wood as it scrambled for purchase. Yellow eyes locked on Eric's terrified face. Astrid grabbed the nearest thing she could find, a heavy iron poker they used for their hearth, and swung it at the beast's head. The blow connected with a sickening crack, and the wolf tumbled backward into the snow with a yelp of pain. But more were coming. They poured out of the storm like living shadows, their howls echoing off the mountain walls until the very air seemed to vibrate with sound. The horses were foaming at their mouths now, driven to madness by terror and exhaustion. "The cliff!" Ingrid screamed. "We're too close to the edge." Astrid looked ahead and saw their doom approaching. The path curved sharply around a rocky outcropping, with nothing but empty air on one side and a sheer stone wall on the other. If the horses couldn't make the turn at this speed, they would all plunge into the abyss below. "Jump!" she shouted, gathering Eric in her arms. "We have to jump!" But as she prepared to leap from the cart, one of the wolves crashed into the side of the vehicle. Wood splintered and metal screamed as the wheel caught on a stone. The cart tilted sideways, throwing its passengers toward the cliff edge. Astrid found herself falling, Eric's weight in her arms as they tumbled through the air. Snow and darkness swirled around them. She heard Ingrid screaming her name, heard the terrible sound of splintering wood and screaming horses. Then her head struck something hard and cold, and the world exploded into stars and pain. The last thing she remembered was Eric's voice calling out as strong hands pulled him away from the edge. Then consciousness fled, and Astrid Bjornsdottir fell into darkness while the storm raged on above, covering her still form with its white embrace. Above, on the path, the wolves gathered around the wreckage of the cart. But these were not mere beasts. Even in their animal forms, they moved with purpose and intelligence. Their leader, the great black wolf, sniffed at the air where Astrid had fallen. His amber eyes gleamed with satisfaction. The Beta's family had been found, and soon the kingdom's strength would be broken, one loyal bloodline at a time. The hunt was far from over, but tonight's work was nearly done. Only one more task remained before they could return to their master with news of success. The black wolf lifted his massive head and howled once more into the storm, a sound of triumph that echoed across the frozen mountains like a promise of darker days to come. Chapter 3. Claws of Destiny. Dawn crept slowly across the mountain peaks, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of rose and gold. The storm had passed in the night, leaving behind a world wrapped in pristine white silence. Deep in the valley where Astrid had fallen, frost glittered like scattered diamonds on the pine branches that had broken her fall. Her unconscious form lay half-buried beneath a drift, dark hair spread like spilled ink against the virgin snow. Miles above on the main path, King Ragnar Ironwolf guided his massive destrier through the wreckage of the overturned cart. The wooden vehicle lay shattered against the cliff face, its contents scattered across the frozen ground. Dark stains marked the snow where blood had spilled, though whether from human or horse he could not yet tell. His ice-blue eyes swept the scene with the practiced assessment of a warrior who had witnessed too many battlefields. "The attack was coordinated, my lord," reported Bjorn Ravenshield, his most trusted captain. The grizzled warrior knelt beside deep paw prints that crisscrossed the area. These tracks show at least 8 wolves, maybe more. They herded the cart toward this exact spot. This was no random hunt. Ragnar dismounted, his powerful frame moving with deadly grace despite the treacherous footing. At 29, he had ruled the northern kingdoms for 7 years, and his body bore the scars of countless battles fought to protect his people. His broad shoulders strained against the leather of his armor as he crouched to examine the evidence more closely. "Shifters," he growled, noting the unnatural size of the paw prints. "The same pack we've been hunting for weeks." His jaw clenched beneath his thick black beard. "They're growing bolder, attacking so close to Ironhold itself." Fenrir paced restlessly at his master's side, the gray wolf's amber eyes scanning the scattered debris. Unlike the beastmen who had caused this carnage, Fenrir was something far more ancient. A true wolf whose bloodline stretched back to the first days when gods walked among mortals. His coat gleamed silver in the morning light, and intelligence far beyond that of ordinary animals shone in his steady gaze. "Sir," called another warrior from the cliff's edge, "there are drag marks here. Survivors were taken." Ragnar strode to the indicated spot, his boots crunching through snow that came nearly to his knees. The evidence was clear. 2 people had been pulled from the wreckage and hauled away into the forest. The trail was already several hours old, but still fresh enough to follow. "How many dead?" he asked grimly. "The horses, my lord, but no human bodies." Bjorn's weathered face showed relief mixed with concern. "Whoever was in this cart, they lived through the crash." "Then we hunt," Ragnar declared, his voice carrying the authority of absolute command. "These rogue shifters have been terrorizing my lands for too long. Every family they destroy weakens the bonds that hold our kingdom together." As he spoke, Fenrir suddenly lifted his gray head, nostrils flaring as he tested the wind. The wolf's ears perked forward, Then he bounded away from the wreckage site, following some scent that had caught his attention. Ragnar watched his companion disappear into a stand of snow-laden pines, trusting the animal's instincts completely. "Spread out," he commanded his men. "Search for any survivors. These monsters may have left someone behind." The king followed Fenrir's trail, pushing through undergrowth that grabbed at his thick cloak. His breath formed white clouds in the frigid air as he climbed down into the valley where the wolf had vanished. Ancient trees towered overhead, their branches forming a cathedral of green and white that muffled all sound except the crunch of his footsteps. He found Fenrir sitting motionless beside a large snowdrift, the wolf's amber gaze fixed on something half-hidden beneath the white expanse. As Ragnar approached, he could make out the edge of dark fabric, then the pale curve of a woman's hand protruding from the snow. "By Odin's beard," he breathed, dropping to his knees beside the drift. He began scooping away snow with urgent movements, revealing first an arm, then a shoulder wrapped in thick woolen cloth. When he cleared the snow from her face, his breath caught in his throat. Black hair framed features that were both delicate and strong. High cheekbones, full lips now blue with cold. Skin pale as moonlight, she was unconscious but breathing, each exhale forming small puffs of vapor in the icy air. A purple bruise marred her temple where she had struck something during her fall, but she appeared otherwise unharmed. Ragnar recognized her instantly. The girl from the funeral, the one who had stood apart from the crowd in her grief. Bjorn's daughter, the Beda's child who had loved her father with such obvious devotion. But what was she doing on this mountain path, and where were the rest of her family? "Can you hear me?" he asked softly, brushing snow from her cheeks with surprisingly gentle hands. "You're safe now." Astrid's green eyes fluttered open, unfocused and confused. She tried to sit up but gasped in pain, one hand flying to her head where the bruise throbbed. For a moment, she stared at the man kneeling beside her without recognition, seeing only a powerfully built stranger with kind eyes. "Easy," Ragnar murmured, steadying her with one large hand on her shoulder. "You've taken a serious blow to the head. Don't try to move too quickly." Memory came flooding back. The wolves, the cart overturning, the terrible moment of falling through empty air. "Eric," she gasped, struggling against Ragnar's restraining grip. "My brother. Where is my brother? And my mother? The wolves. Calm yourself," the king said firmly. "I am Ragnar Ironwolf. You are under my protection now. Tell me what happened here." Recognition dawned in Astrid's eyes as she took in his distinctive features. The authority in his voice, the royal signet ring on his sword hand. "Your Majesty," she whispered, trying again to sit up despite her obvious pain. We were traveling home from my father's funeral when—" "Bjorn Ironshield was your father?" Ragnar's expression darkened. "Then this attack was no coincidence. The same shifters who have been murdering loyal families throughout my kingdom. They came for you specifically." Astrid's face went white as understanding struck her. "They wanted to kill us because father served you faithfully? Where are your mother and brother now?" Ragnar asked urgently. "The trail suggests 2 people were taken alive." Tears began streaming down Astrid's cheeks, freezing before they could fall far. "I don't know. I was carrying Eric when the cart overturned. He was pulled away from me. I heard my mother screaming his name." Her voice broke. "They could be anywhere. They could be—" "They live," Ragnar said with absolute certainty. "These shifters don't kill their captives immediately. They use them as bait or leverage." He helped her to her feet, noting how she swayed despite his support. "We will find them." Fenrir approached cautiously, studying Astrid with curious amber eyes. The wolf had never shown interest in strangers before, yet something about this girl seemed to intrigue him. He sniffed at her outstretched hand, then surprised both humans by gently nuzzling her palm. "Remarkable," Ragnar murmured, watching the interaction. "Fenrir has never accepted a stranger so readily. His bloodline makes him particular about whom he trusts." Astrid looked between the king and his wolf companion, confusion evident on her bruised face. "I don't understand. Why would he care about me? I'm nobody special. Just a Beda's daughter who couldn't even protect her own family." The bitterness in her voice told Ragnar more about her life than any formal introduction could have. Here was a girl who had been made to feel worthless, despite obvious intelligence and courage. She had survived a fall that should have killed her, had tried to shield her brother even as their world collapsed around them. "You underestimate yourself," he said quietly. "It takes remarkable strength to endure what you've experienced, and still worry about others before yourself." Before Astrid could respond, shouts echoed from above as Ragnar's men called down into the valley. "My lord, we've found their trail!" Ragnar cupped his hands around his mouth and called back, "Coming!" Then he turned to Astrid, studying her pale face and unsteady stance. "You're in no condition to travel, but I won't leave you here alone. Can you ride?" "I can do whatever is necessary to save my family," Astrid replied with fierce determination, though she had to grip a nearby tree trunk to keep from swaying. "Then we hunt together," Ragnar decided. "But first, you need warmth and food." He shrugged out of his heavy fur cloak and wrapped it around her shoulders, ignoring her protests. The garment swallowed her smaller frame, but it would keep her from freezing during the journey ahead. As they climbed back toward the path where his men waited, Ragnar found his thoughts dwelling on the girl walking beside him. She moved with quiet dignity despite her obvious pain, never complaining about discomfort or asking for special consideration. Her concern was entirely for her captured family members, not for her own suffering. Fenrir padded along at Astrid's other side, occasionally brushing against her leg as if offering comfort. The wolf's behavior was unprecedented. He had always been aloof with everyone except Ragnar himself. Yet here he was, appointing himself as this stranger's guardian without any command from his master. When they reached the main path, Ragnar's warriors had prepared a horse for Astrid and gathered supplies for an extended pursuit. The trail left by the shifters led deeper into the mountains, toward territories that few humans had ever explored. The captives were taken to the old fortress at Ravenspeak. Bjorn reported grimly. "It's been abandoned for decades, but it would make an ideal stronghold for enemies of the realm." Ragnar helped Astrid mount her horse, noting how she bit her lip to keep from crying out when movement jarred her injured head. "We ride hard," he announced to his men. "Every moment we delay gives these murderers more time to hurt innocent people." As the hunting party set out into the wilderness, Astrid rode close behind the king, drawing strength from his unwavering determination. For the first time since the attack, she allowed herself to hope that Eric and her mother might survive this nightmare. Whatever else happened, she would not face this ordeal alone. Chapter 4. Within Iron Walls. The great hall of Ironhold rose like a cathedral of stone and timber, its vaulted ceiling disappearing into shadows that danced with firelight from massive hearths. Astrid had never imagined such grandeur. Tapestries depicting legendary battles hung between towering columns, while shields and weapons of fallen heroes adorned the walls like sacred relics. The air hummed with quiet activity as servants moved through the space, their soft footsteps muffled by thick rushes scattered across the stone floor. 3 days had passed since Ragnar found her buried in snow. 3 days of drifting in and out of fevered sleep while palace healers tended her injuries. Now she sat propped against silk pillows in a chamber that seemed fit for royalty, staring out tall windows at the courtyard below, where soldiers practiced their sword work in the pale afternoon light. A gentle knock at the door interrupted her brooding. "Come," she called softly, expecting one of the serving women who had been caring for her with such unexpected kindness. Instead, King Ragnar entered, ducking slightly to clear the doorframe. His massive presence seemed to fill the chamber even more than it had filled the wilderness. Today, he wore simple leather and wool rather than armor, but nothing could diminish the raw power that emanated from his broad shoulders and confident stride. His black hair was pulled back with a leather cord, revealing the strong lines of his face and those penetrating ice-blue eyes that seemed to see everything. "How do you feel today?" he asked, settling into a chair beside her bed. The furniture creaked under his weight, reminding Astrid of just how large and solid he truly was. "Stronger, Your Majesty," she replied, though her voice still carried traces of exhaustion. "The healers say I was fortunate. The bruising looks worse than it actually is." She touched the purple mark on her temple self-consciously. "I should not be taking up space in your palace when so many others have greater need. You were nearly killed protecting your family," Ragnar said firmly. "You have every right to recover in comfort and safety." His expression darkened. Though I wish I had better news about your search efforts. Astrid's heart clenched. You found no trace of them? We followed the trail to an abandoned fortress deep in the mountains. But it was empty when we arrived. The shifters had moved on, taking their captives with them. Ragnar leaned forward, his massive hands clasped between his knees. But we did find evidence of their identity. The leader goes by the name Gunnar Bloodfang, a shifter I exiled from these lands 7 years ago for crimes against innocent families. What kind of crimes? Astrid asked, though part of her dreaded the answer. Murder, torture. He led a pack of rogues who believed shifters should rule over ordinary humans rather than live in harmony with them. Ragnar's jaw tightened. When I refused to allow such behavior in my kingdom, he swore vengeance against me and anyone who served my crown faithfully. The implication struck Astrid like a physical blow. So my father died because of his loyalty to you. And now my family suffers the same fate. Your father died of fever, Ragnar corrected gently. But yes, his years of faithful service made your family a target for revenge. He met her eyes directly. I failed to protect you. That responsibility weighs heavily on my conscience. Astrid studied his face, surprised by the genuine remorse she saw there. Kings were not supposed to concern themselves with individual subjects, yet this man seemed genuinely troubled by her family's fate. You could not have known they would attack so far from their usual territory. I should have anticipated it, Ragnar insisted. Gunnar is cunning. He knows that striking at loyal families will weaken the bonds between ruler and subject. Fear spreads faster than wildfire in times of uncertainty. A commotion in the courtyard below drew their attention to the windows. Astrid could see servants hurrying about their duties, while guards changed shifts at the gates. The palace hummed with constant activity, yet she felt strangely isolated from it all, a temporary guest in a world where she would never truly belong. The court speaks of little else but your decision to shelter me here, she said quietly. I hear their whispers when they think I'm sleeping. They wonder why their king concerns himself with a common girl of such unremarkable appearance. Ragnar's eyes flashed with anger. Who dares speak such nonsense in my presence? Not in your presence, your majesty. But servants hear everything, and they are not unkind in their gossip, merely honest. Astrid pulled the silk coverlet higher, suddenly aware of how her soft curves must look to courtiers accustomed to elegant noble ladies. They question whether I bring some political advantage, or whether you act from misguided pity. And what do you believe? Ragnar asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Astrid met his gaze despite the heat rising in her cheeks. I believe you are a good man who feels responsible for what happened to my family. But I also know that kindness has limits, especially when it becomes inconvenient. Before Ragnar could respond, scratching at the door announced Fenrir's arrival. The gray wolf padded into the chamber as if he belonged there, amber eyes immediately seeking out Astrid. To everyone's amazement, he had taken to sleeping outside her door each night, refusing to be moved despite the servants' protests. Even my most trusted companion disagrees with your assessment, Ragnar observed, as Fenrir settled beside Astrid's bed with a contented sigh. He has never shown such devotion to anyone but me. Astrid reached down to stroke the wolf's silver-gray fur, finding comfort in his steady presence. Perhaps he pities me as well. Wolves don't feel pity, Ragnar said seriously. They respond to character, to strength and authenticity that others might overlook. He paused, choosing his words carefully. Fenrir's bloodline stretches back to the first days of our people. Legend says his ancestors could sense the true nature of any soul they encountered. And what does that mean for me? It means you possess qualities that others have failed to recognize, including yourself. Ragnar rose from his chair, moving to the window where afternoon light outlined his powerful silhouette. Tell me about your knowledge of herbs and healing. The servants mention you helped tend wounded soldiers during my absence. Astrid flushed with embarrassment. I only did what anyone would do. Those men were suffering, and I learned some small skills from my father about treating injuries. She gestured helplessly. It seemed wrong to sit idle while others were in pain. The court physician tells a different story. He says you identified a dangerous infection that he had missed and prepared a treatment that saved the man's life. Ragnar turned back to face her. Such knowledge doesn't come from casual observation. My father believed everyone should understand basic healing, Astrid explained. He said a beta's duties included caring for his people in all circumstances, not just in battle. He taught me to recognize different plants, how to prepare tinctures and poultices, which combinations could fight fever or prevent corruption in a broken bone. Valuable skills in any court, Ragnar noted. Yet I suspect there's more. What other abilities did Bjorn Ironshield pass to his daughter? Astrid hesitated, uncertain why the king seemed so interested in her modest accomplishments. I can read and write in 3 languages. I know the histories of the great families, the old laws that govern trade agreements and marriage contracts. Father said knowledge was the only inheritance he could give me that no one could steal away. Wise counsel. Ragnar returned to his chair, studying her with renewed interest. And yet you believe yourself unremarkable. I know what I am, Your Majesty. Astrid replied with quiet dignity. I am too large, too plain, too scholarly for most men's tastes. I lack the grace and beauty expected of noble ladies. These are simple facts, not complaints. Whose voice do I hear when you speak such words? Ragnar asked softly. Your own? Or someone else's? The question struck deeper than Astrid expected. She thought of her mother's constant criticisms, the way Ingrid compared her unfavorably to every slender, golden-haired girl in their village. Does it matter? The world judges by appearances, and I have learned to accept that reality. The world is often wrong, Ragnar said firmly. I have seen supposed beauties whose souls were ugly as winter storms, and overlooked others whose worth far exceeded their recognition. Footsteps in the corridor announced the arrival of another visitor. Captain Bjorn Ravenshield appeared in the doorway, his weathered face grim with news. My lord, we have reports from our scouts. The rogue pack has been spotted moving toward the eastern territories. Ragnar stood immediately, his attention shifting to matters of warfare and strategy. How many villages lie in their path? At least 6, my lord, including the trading post at Millhaven. If they strike during market day, Bjorn left the implications unspoken. Then we ride at dawn, Ragnar decided. Double the patrols along the eastern borders and send word to all settlements to prepare their defenses. He glanced back at Astrid. I must leave you again, but you have my word. We will not rest until your family is found, and these murderers are brought to justice. After the men departed to plan their campaign, Astrid remained in the large chamber with only Fenrir for company. She tried to read from the collection of books that Ragnar had provided, but her thoughts kept returning to his strange questions about her worth and abilities. Why did he seem to see something in her that others missed? And why did his good opinion matter so much to someone who had learned to expect little from the world? Outside her windows, the sun began to set behind the mountain peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Soon the king would ride out again, risking his life to hunt the monsters who had destroyed her peaceful existence. She found herself praying to whatever gods might listen that he would return safely, not because she needed his protection, but because the world needed leaders who cared about justice for even the most humble of their subjects. Fenrir lifted his great head and gazed at her with those knowing amber eyes, as if he understood the turmoil in her heart. Astrid scratched behind his ears and whispered, What do you see in me, old friend? What truth am I too blind to recognize in myself? The wolf's only answer was to rest his chin across her feet, a gesture of loyalty and protection that warmed her heart more than all the silk and luxury surrounding her. Whatever the future held, she would face it with the dignity her father had taught her, and the courage that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. Chapter 5. Blood on the Trail. The morning mist clung to the forest floor like ghostly fingers, creating an otherworldly landscape of silver and shadow. Astrid rode beside King Ragnar through the ancient woodland, her borrowed mare picking carefully along a trail that seemed to exist more in memory than reality. 5 days had passed since she convinced him to allow her participation in the hunt for Gunnar Bloodfang's pack. 5 days of following increasingly cold traces through territories that few humans had ever explored. The track split here, called Bjorn Ravenshield from ahead, his weathered face creased with concentration as he studied the forest floor. One group headed north toward the old mining camps, but the larger party continued east into the deep woods. Ragnar reined in his massive destrier, the black warhorse snorting white breath into the frigid air. At 29, the king moved with the fluid grace of a born warrior, every muscle in his powerful frame alert to potential danger. His ice-blue eyes swept the surrounding trees, noting broken branches and disturbed undergrowth that spoke of recent passage by large predators. "The northern trail is meant to divide our forces," he decided after a moment's consideration. "Gunnar is too cunning to split his own pack unless it serves a greater purpose." His gaze found Astrid's, acknowledging her presence in the hunting party despite the ongoing protests from several of his men. "What does your knowledge of this region suggest?" Astrid urged her mare closer, studying the diverging paths with eyes that had learned to read the forest's subtle messages during childhood expeditions with her father. "The northern route leads to abandoned copper mines, treacherous terrain with numerous caves and hidden passages. Perfect for an ambush." She pointed toward the eastern trail. "But this path connects to the old trade roads. If they're moving captives, they would choose the easier route despite the greater exposure." "Sound reasoning," Ragnar approved, earning glares from some of his more traditional warriors who still questioned allowing a woman to participate in such dangerous work. "We follow the eastern trail, but send scouts to watch the northern approach. I won't be caught off guard by Gunnar's deceptions again." As the hunting party reorganized itself, Astrid found herself riding alongside Marcus Ironforge, the youngest of Ragnar's sworn men. At barely 21, he possessed the eager enthusiasm of youth, combined with enough skill to earn his place among the king's elite guard. Unlike some of his companions, Marcus showed no resentment toward Astrid's inclusion in their ranks. "You truly learned all this forest craft from your father?" he asked with genuine curiosity as they navigated between massive oak trees whose trunks could have hidden entire buildings. "Bjorn Ironshield believed knowledge was the greatest weapon any person could possess," Astrid replied, ducking beneath a low-hanging branch. "He taught me to read tracks, identify edible plants, find fresh water, predict weather changes, skills that proved useful when leading trading expeditions through unfamiliar territory. Most noble fathers would consider such education wasted on a daughter," Marcus observed without malice, simply stating what they both knew to be true. Astrid's smile held more sadness than bitterness. "My father was not most men. He said the world would judge me harshly enough without his adding to the burden." She paused, remembering strong hands steadying her as she learned to track deer through winter snow. "He wanted me to be capable of surviving whatever life might bring." Ahead of them, Fenrir suddenly froze, his gray coat bristling as amber eyes fixed on something invisible to human senses. The wolf's behavior immediately alerted every member of the hunting party. His supernatural instincts had saved their lives on more than one occasion during the past few days. Ragnar raised his hand for silence, dismounting with fluid grace despite his imposing size. His broad shoulders strained against leather armor as he crouched beside his wolf companion, following Fenrir's intense gaze toward a cluster of ancient standing stones barely visible through the morning mist. "What is it, old friend?" the king murmured, one large hand resting on Fenrir's neck. The wolf whined softly, a sound that raised hackles on every human present. Something was terribly wrong. Astrid slipped from her saddle without being asked, her movements far quieter than anyone expected from someone of her size. Years of accompanying her father on hunting expeditions had taught her the value of stealth in dangerous situations. She approached the stone circle carefully, noting details that others might overlook. "Blood," she whispered, pointing to dark stains on several of the ancient monuments. Fresh, but not human. Her nose wrinkled at a scent that seemed wrong somehow. Too sharp, too wild, and something else, something that makes my skin crawl. Ragnar joined her investigation, his warrior's instincts confirming what she had already detected. "Shifter blood," he identified grimly, but not from Gunnar's pack. His ice-blue eyes swept the circle of stones, taking in additional evidence that painted a disturbing picture. This was a ritual site. Someone, or something, was sacrificed here recently. Captain Bjorn approached with 3 of his most experienced trackers, their faces grim as they examined the scene. "My lord, we've found signs of a struggle. At least 2 different shifter packs were involved. The scent traces are distinct enough to separate. Gunnar has allies," Ragnar concluded, his voice deadly quiet. "Or he's absorbed another rogue pack into his forces." The implications were staggering. If the exiled shifter had managed to unite multiple groups of outcasts and criminals, His threat to the kingdom had just increased exponentially. Astrid knelt beside one of the stained stones, her knowledge of healing practices helping her interpret what others might miss. "The blood patterns suggest torture rather than quick death," she said softly, fighting against the nausea that rose in her throat. "Whoever died here suffered for a considerable time before the end came." "Information gathering," Marcus suggested, his young face pale but determined. "They were questioning someone about our movements, our strength, our plans, or about specific targets," Ragnar added darkly. "Gunnar knows I'll come after him personally. He may be seeking intelligence about my companions, my habits, my weaknesses." His gaze found Astrid's. "Including anyone who travels with me." The warning was clear, but Astrid straightened her shoulders with quiet determination. "I knew the risks when I asked to join this hunt, Your Majesty. My family's fate depends on finding Gunnar's stronghold, regardless of the personal danger." Fenrir's sudden movement interrupted their conversation. The gray wolf had been circling the stone formation, following scent trails invisible to human noses. Now he stood rigid at the circle's eastern edge, every line of his body indicating urgent alarm. "He's found something," Ragnar said, drawing his sword in one smooth motion. The blade sang as it cleared the scabbard, its steel reflecting the pale morning light like captured lightning. "Everyone stay alert. We may not be alone here." They followed Fenrir deeper into the forest, where massive trees created a canopy so thick that midday felt like twilight. The wolf led them to a clearing where the remains of a recent camp were scattered among the underbrush. Torn fabric, broken weapons, the ashes of deliberately extinguished fires. "They were here 2 days ago," Bjorn reported after examining the evidence. "A large group, at least 15 individuals based on the bedding areas." He pointed toward the clearing's far edge. "The trail continues east, but they're moving faster now, almost as if they're heading toward a specific destination." Astrid studied the abandoned campsite with growing unease. Something about the arrangement troubled her, though she couldn't immediately identify what bothered her about the scene. Then understanding struck like a physical blow. "There," she said, pointing toward a cluster of discarded items near what had been the central fire pit. "Those are my mother's traveling clothes. The blue cloak she wore when we left Ironhold." Her voice caught as she recognized other familiar objects scattered through the debris. "And that leather pouch belonged to Eric. He kept his collection of smooth stones in it." Ragnar's expression darkened as he examined the items she had identified. "They want us to find these things," he realized. "Gunnar is leaving a trail deliberately, drawing us toward whatever trap he's prepared. But we have to follow it," Astrid said desperately. "If there's any chance my family is still alive." "Of course we follow," Ragnar assured her. "But we do so with full knowledge that we're walking into an ambush." He turned to address his men. "Double the watch rotations. No one travels alone, not even to relieve themselves. And trust nothing that seems convenient or obvious. Gunnar's survived 7 years of exile by being smarter than his enemies expect." As they prepared to continue the pursuit, Astrid found herself walking beside the king, their horses following the increasingly obvious trail left by their quarry. "Why would you risk so much for my family?" she asked quietly. "You have an entire kingdom to protect. Surely 2 captives aren't worth endangering yourself and your best warriors." Ragnar was silent for so long that Astrid began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried depth she had never heard before. 7 years ago, when I first became king, I believed that ruling meant making decisions for the greater good, sacrificing individuals to protect the majority." His ice blue eyes found hers. "Gunnar's first victims taught me how wrong that thinking was. A kingdom that doesn't fight for its most vulnerable citizens isn't worth preserving. Even citizens like me?" Astrid asked softly. "Even those who contribute little and take up more than their share of space." Ragnar's destrier came to an abrupt halt. The king's powerful frame radiated sudden tension as he turned to face her fully. "Is that truly how you see yourself?" Astrid flushed, but maintained eye contact. "It's how others see me, Your Majesty. I've learned to accept reality rather than cling to comfortable delusions." "Then you've learned the wrong lessons from cruel teachers," Ragnar said firmly. "What I see is a woman brave enough to demand inclusion in a dangerous hunt, intelligent enough to read signs that trained warriors miss, and strong enough to endure tragedy without losing compassion for others. His voice softened slightly. Your father raised a remarkable daughter. It saddens me that she can't recognize her own worth. Before Astrid could respond, shouts from ahead announced that the scouts had made a discovery. They had reached the edge of a vast valley, where an ancient fortress perched on a rocky outcropping, like a stone predator surveying its domain. Smoke rose from chimneys that shouldn't have been active in an abandoned structure, and movement on the walls suggested the presence of armed guards. Ravenspeak Fortress, Bjorn identified grimly. I should have guessed Gunnar would claim it as his stronghold. The place has been cursed since the old kings fell. Ragnar studied the distant fortress through a spyglass, noting defensive positions and potential approaches. How many men would it take to storm those walls? More than we have, Bjorn replied honestly. But if we're clever about it— No, Astrid interrupted, her voice carrying unexpected authority. A direct assault will get my family killed before you breach the first wall. She pointed toward the fortress. But I know another way in. My father told me stories about the old smugglers' tunnels that connected to the wine cellars. Ragnar lowered his spyglass, studying Astrid with new respect. You're suggesting infiltration rather than siege? I'm suggesting we use intelligence instead of brute force, she replied. Sometimes the smallest key opens the largest door. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the valley, the hunting party made camp in a concealed grove where they could observe their target without being seen. Tomorrow would bring either victory or disaster, but tonight they would plan with the care that meant the difference between rescue and tragedy. Fenrir settled beside Astrid as she tended the small fire that would cook their evening meal, his amber eyes reflecting flames that danced like captured spirits. Whatever tomorrow brought, she would face it with the courage her father had instilled, and the growing confidence that perhaps, just perhaps, she was stronger than she had ever dared believe. Chapter 6. Rescue in the Shadows. The ancient stones of Ravenspeak Fortress loomed against the star-filled sky like the bones of some primordial beast. Astrid pressed herself against the cold rock wall of the smuggler's tunnel, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain every guard in the fortress could hear it. The passage her father had described in his stories proved real enough, though decades of neglect had filled it with debris and the acrid smell of decay. Behind her, King Ragnar moved with surprising silence for such a massive man. His broad shoulders nearly scraped the tunnel walls, and she could feel the heat radiating from his powerful frame in the confined space. Captain Bjorn and 2 other warriors followed, their weapons muffled in cloth to prevent any betraying sounds. They had left the rest of their forces positioned around the fortress perimeter, ready to create a distraction if the infiltration went wrong. How much further? Ragnar breathed against her ear, his voice barely audible even at such close range. Astrid consulted the crude map she had sketched from her father's descriptions. The tunnel should connect to the wine cellars beneath the Great Hall. From there, we can access the prison levels through the servant stairs. She paused, listening to the distant sounds filtering down from above. But Your Majesty, if we're discovered— We won't be, Ragnar interrupted with quiet confidence. You've guided us this far flawlessly. Trust your father's knowledge. The tunnel began to slope upward, and soon they could make out a faint glow ahead, torchlight leaking through gaps in what appeared to be a wooden door. Astrid approached carefully, testing each stone before putting her full weight down. One loose rock could bring the entire plan crashing down around them. At the door, she pressed her ear against the weathered wood. The sound of dripping water suggested they had reached the cellars, but she could also hear something else. Voices, muffled, but definitely human. Her pulse quickened as she recognized one of them. Eric, she whispered, tears starting in her eyes. My brother is alive. Ragnar placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. Easy. We need to know how many guards, what kind of defenses they've arranged. His ice-blue eyes were hard as winter steel. One mistake here could cost all their lives. Through a crack in the door, Astrid could see into a stone chamber lit by flickering torches. Wooden cages lined the walls, crude prison cells that held perhaps a dozen captives. In the nearest cage, she spotted Eric's small form huddled in a corner, his dark hair matted and his clothes torn. He appeared unharmed but terrified, clutching something against his chest. I see at least 6 prisoners, she reported quietly. Eric is there and— Oh gods, There's my mother. Ingrid sat in a separate cage, her normally pristine appearance disheveled, and her face marked by what looked like recent bruising. But she was alive and alert, her pale eyes darting constantly toward the chamber's single entrance, as if watching for opportunity. 2 shifters in human form guarded the prison level, burly men with the scarred faces and predatory eyes of career criminals. They lounged near a wooden table covered with dice and ale cups, clearly bored by their assignment, but still dangerous enough to present a serious threat. "Wait here," Ragnar commanded softly. "Let me handle the guards." Before Astrid could protest, the king slipped through the door with liquid grace. She watched in fascination as he moved like a stalking predator, crossing the chamber in complete silence. The first guard died without ever knowing death approached, Ragnar's powerful hands snapping his neck with clinical efficiency. The second guard started to turn, perhaps sensing his companion's sudden absence, but never completed the movement as steel slid between his ribs. "Clear," Ragnar called softly, dragging the bodies into the shadows. Astrid rushed to Eric's cage, her hands trembling as she worked on the crude lock with tools Ragnar provided. "Eric, oh my sweet boy, are you hurt?" Her little brother looked up with eyes that seemed far too old for his 8 years. "Astrid, is it really you?" His voice was hoarse from crying, but he struggled to his feet and pressed against the cage bars. "I was so scared. The monsters said you were dead. I'm here now," Astrid assured him, finally managing to spring the lock. She gathered him into her arms, noting how thin he had become in just over a week of captivity. "You're safe. We're taking you home. They made us watch," Eric whispered against her neck. "They brought other people here, and they hurt them." Mama tried to cover my eyes, but I could still hear the screaming. Rage unlike anything she had ever experienced flooded through Astrid. These monsters had not only terrorized her family but had traumatized a child with sights no innocent should ever witness. She found herself understanding why Ragnar had exiled Gunnar Bloodfang. Such creatures forfeited any claim to mercy. Ragnar had freed Ingrid and was working on the other prisoners' cages. Her mother approached with obvious wariness, clearly uncertain whether this rescue was real or another cruel deception. When she recognized Astrid, her expression shifted through surprise, relief, and finally a familiar criticism. "What are you doing here?" Ingrid hissed. "This is no place for someone like you. You should have sent proper warriors, not risked yourself in such foolishness. Your daughter is the reason we found you," Ragnar said firmly, as he helped an elderly man from his cage. Her knowledge of these tunnels made this rescue possible. Ingrid's pale eyes flicked between her daughter and the king, calculation evident in her expression. "Your Majesty," she said with elaborate courtesy, "I am grateful beyond words for your intervention. But surely you understand that Astrid's presence here creates unnecessary complications." "Mother, please," Astrid interrupted. "We need to focus on getting everyone to safety." "She's right," Ragnar agreed. "We can discuss family dynamics later. Right now, we need to move these people out before—" The sound of heavy footsteps on stone stairs cut him off. Someone was descending toward the prison level, and by the confident pace, it was clearly not a prisoner. "Back into the tunnel," Ragnar ordered urgently. "Get the captives moving. I'll handle whoever's coming." But before anyone could move, a voice echoed down the stairwell, deep, mocking, and filled with predatory anticipation. "No need to hurry, Ragnar Ironwolf. I've been expecting you." Gunnar Bloodfang appeared at the bottom of the stairs, and Astrid's breath caught at the sight of him. Even in human form, the exiled shifter radiated savage power. He stood nearly as tall as Ragnar, with shoulders almost as broad. But where the king's strength seemed controlled and purposeful, Gunnar's felt wild and barely contained. His hair was the color of dried blood, his eyes like molten amber, and scars crisscrossed his arms and face like a map of violence. 7 years, Gunnar continued conversationally, stepping into the chamber with the easy confidence of a man on his own territory. 7 years since you cast me out for having the vision to see what our people could become. His gaze swept over the freed prisoners with contempt. "And you risk everything for these cattle." "They are my subjects," Ragnar replied, moving to place himself between Gunnar and the civilians. "I protect what is mine." How noble, how pathetically weak. Gunnar's laugh was like the sound of breaking glass. You could have been a god among mortals, Ragnar. Instead, you choose to be their shepherd. The two alphas began circling each other, and Astrid could feel the supernatural tension building in the air. Both men radiated power that made her skin crawl and her hair stand on end. She had never witnessed a confrontation between shifter lords before. The sheer force of their presence was almost overwhelming. Your father understood power, Gunnar taunted. He knew that strength was meant to dominate, not serve. If he could see what you've become. My father would be proud that I chose justice over tyranny, Ragnar snarled, his control finally slipping. You murdered him and my mother to satisfy your twisted ambitions. I freed you from their weakness, Gunnar roared, his human facade beginning to crack. And tonight, I'll finish what I started all those years ago. The transformation began without warning. Both men's bodies convulsed as bones cracked and reformed, muscles bulging beneath skin that sprouted thick fur. In moments, two massive wolves faced each other in the stone chamber. One black as midnight, the other the russet color of spilled blood. The battle that followed was beyond anything Astrid had imagined possible. The wolves crashed together with bone-jarring force, fangs seeking throats, claws tearing flesh. They rolled across the stone floor in a tangle of fur and fury, their snarls echoing off the walls like thunder. Ragnar fought with the disciplined ferocity of a trained warrior. Every attack calculated for maximum effect, but Gunnar was larger, his movements fueled by years of bitter hatred and the desperate strength of someone with nothing left to lose. When they separated for a moment, both wolves bore bleeding gashes, and their eyes burned with murderous intensity. The tunnel! Astrid shouted to the other prisoners. Everyone into the tunnel now. She tried to shepherd Eric and the others toward safety, but her brother suddenly cried out in terror. Behind you! Astrid spun to see another shifter dropping from the ceiling. Apparently Gunnar had positioned backup guards in hidden positions throughout the chamber. This one was smaller than the alpha, but no less dangerous. His wolf form lean and quick as a striking serpent. The beast lunged directly at Eric, clearly intending to use the child as leverage against their attackers. Astrid didn't think. She simply moved, throwing herself between the wolf and her brother. Claws raked across her shoulder and down her arm, tearing through fabric and flesh with equal ease. Pain exploded through her body, but she managed to grab a fallen torch and thrust it at the creature's face. The wolf yelped and recoiled, giving Ragnar the opening he needed. Even while engaged with Gunnar, the king had been aware of the threat to the prisoners. He broke away from his primary opponent and launched himself at Astrid's attacker, jaws closing around the smaller wolf's throat with crushing force. But the distraction cost him. Gunnar recovered quickly and struck like a battering ram, massive paws catching Ragnar in the ribs and sending him crashing into the stone wall. The king rolled desperately as killing fangs snapped at his neck, missing by inches. Blood streamed down Astrid's arm, but she ignored the pain as she helped Eric toward the tunnel entrance. Her mother had already fled with several other prisoners, showing no concern for her daughter's injury. The old man Ragnar had freed moved slowly but steadily, supported by another captive. The battle between the alphas continued with savage intensity. Both wolves were bleeding from multiple injuries now, their movements beginning to show signs of exhaustion. But Gunnar seemed to have a slight advantage. His years of living wild had hardened him, while Ragnar's civilized life had perhaps softened him just enough to matter in such a primal contest. Astrid watched in horror as Gunnar's jaws closed around Ragnar's hind leg, his fangs grinding against bone. The king's howl of pain echoed through the chamber, and she could see his strength beginning to fail. Without thinking, she grabbed the heaviest object she could find, an iron candlestick from the guard's table, and brought it down on Gunnar's skull with all the force she could muster. The blow wasn't enough to seriously injure such a massive creature, but it startled him enough to release his grip on Ragnar's leg. Gunnar spun toward her, amber eyes blazing with fury that a mere human had dared to interfere in the sacred combat between alphas. He gathered himself to spring, every line of his body promising death for her presumption. But the moment of distraction was all Ragnar needed. The black wolf surged upward, jaws closing around Gunnar's throat just below the jaw. The two beasts crashed to the floor together, rolling in a final, desperate struggle that would determine who lived and who died in this ancient fortress. When the movement finally stopped, only one wolf remained standing. Ragnar stood over Gunnar's still form, blood dripping from dozens of injuries, but victory clearly his. The russet wolf's eyes stared sightlessly at the stone ceiling. His reign of terror finally ended. Astrid sank to her knees as reaction set in, her injured arm throbbing with every heartbeat. But they had won. Her family was safe, the prisoners were free, and the monster who had destroyed so many lives was finally dead. Ragnar's transformation back to human form was slower than usual, exhaustion evident in every movement. When he stood before her as a man again, naked and covered in blood, but undeniably victorious, his first concern was for her injury. "How badly are you hurt?" he asked urgently, dropping to examine her torn shoulder. "I'll live," Astrid managed, though the claw marks burned like fire. "Eric and the others. Are they safe?" "Safe," Ragnar confirmed, tearing strips from his shirt to bind her injuries. "Thanks to your courage." That was incredibly foolish and absolutely necessary. As they helped each other toward the tunnel entrance, Astrid realized something had changed between them. The careful distance of king and subject had burned away in the crucible of shared danger, leaving something deeper and more complex in its place. But there would be time to explore such feelings later. For now, it was enough that they had all survived, and that the shadow of Gunnar Bloodfang would never again darken the peaceful lands of Ironhold. Chapter 7. Between Two Worlds. The great hall of Ironhold buzzed with quiet activity as servants moved between the long tables, clearing away the remnants of the evening meal. Astrid sat in a chair near the massive stone fireplace, her injured arm bound in clean linen, and supported by a silk sling that marked her as a guest of honor rather than a mere patient. 3 weeks had passed since the rescue at Ravenspeak Fortress. 3 weeks of healing, both her physical injuries and the deeper wounds left by her family's ordeal. Eric perched on a cushioned stool beside her chair, looking healthier than he had since before their father's death. The boy's resilience amazed everyone, though nightmares still plagued his sleep. During daylight hours, he explored the palace with the boundless curiosity of childhood. He had become a particular favorite among the castle staff, who delighted in his eager questions and quick smile. "Tell me the story again," Eric pleaded, his green eyes bright with excitement. "About how you hit the bad wolf with the candlestick." "You've heard that tale a dozen times already," Astrid laughed, ruffling his dark hair. "Surely you're tired of your sister's small part in such great events." "Never," Eric declared dramatically. "You were so brave, Astrid. Braver than any knight in the old stories." Before Astrid could respond to his flattery, heavy footsteps announced King Ragnar's approach. Even after weeks in his presence, the sight of him still made her breath catch slightly. His broad shoulders seemed to fill doorways, and despite the healing injuries from his battle with Gunnar, he moved with the fluid power of a born predator. Today he wore simple leather and wool rather than royal finery, but nothing could diminish the aura of command that surrounded him like invisible armor. "Good evening," Ragnar said warmly, settling into the chair across from them. At 29, his face showed the lines of responsibility and conflict, but his ice-blue eyes held genuine warmth when they looked at her family. "How does the arm feel today, Astrid?" "Much better, Your Majesty," she replied, flexing her fingers experimentally. "The healers say the scars will fade with time, though some marks may always remain. Scars earned in defense of family are nothing to be ashamed of," Ragnar observed. "They speak of courage and love, qualities more precious than unmarked skin." Eric nodded enthusiastically. "Astrid says scars tell stories about the important things we've done. She says they're like medals that we carry always." "Your sister is very wise," Ragnar agreed, though his gaze lingered on Astrid's face with an intensity that made warmth spread through her chest. "Speaking of wisdom, I have something to discuss with both of you." The serious tone in his voice made Astrid straighten in her chair. "Is something wrong, Your Majesty? Has there been news of other rogue packs?" "Nothing like that," Ragnar assured her quickly. "This concerns your future, your family's place in the kingdom now that the immediate danger has passed." Before he could continue, sharp footsteps echoed across the stone floor. Ingrid approached their small group, her pale hair perfectly arranged despite the trauma she had endured. The weeks of recovery had restored her physical health, but something in her manner seemed harder than before, more calculating. "Your Majesty," Ingrid said with elaborate courtesy, executing a perfect curtsy despite her obvious impatience. "I hope you'll forgive the interruption, but I must speak with you about our family's situation." Ragnar gestured toward an empty chair. "Please join us." "I was just about to discuss that very topic." Ingrid remained standing, her posture rigid with poorly concealed tension. "Your kindness has been overwhelming, truly, but we cannot continue imposing on your hospitality indefinitely. Our village home awaits our return, and there are obligations." "What obligations?" Astrid asked quietly. "Father's lands and position died with him. We have no formal ties to the old settlement now. We have ties of blood and tradition," Ingrid replied sharply. "More importantly, we have received an offer of marriage that would secure our family's future." Her pale eyes glittered with anticipation. "Lord Bjorn Ravenswood has expressed interest in making me his wife. He's willing to accept both you and Eric as part of the arrangement." The silence that followed was so complete that Astrid could hear the crackling of logs in the fireplace and the distant sound of wind against the windows. She stared at her mother in shock, unable to process what she had just heard. "Ravenswood," Ragnar said finally, his voice carefully neutral. "A minor lord with lands 2 days' ride from here. I know him by reputation. Wealthy, but not particularly admirable. He owns extensive properties and commands respect throughout the region," Ingrid insisted. "For a widow with limited prospects, such an offer represents remarkable good fortune." "And what becomes of me in this arrangement?" Astrid asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Ingrid's expression softened slightly, but her words remained practical and cold. "Ravenswood has a son from his first marriage. Thorin, I believe his name is. He's expressed willingness to consider you as a wife, despite your obvious limitations." The casual cruelty of the statement hit Astrid like a physical blow. Even after everything they had endured together, her mother still saw her as a burden to be disposed of at the first opportunity. "I see," Astrid managed, fighting to keep her voice steady. "And you've already accepted this generous proposal?" "I've sent word that we're considering it favorably," Ingrid admitted. "The formal ceremonies could take place within a month if we return to settle the details." Eric had been listening with growing distress, his young face pale with confusion and fear. "But I don't want to leave," he said in a small voice. "I like it here. Everyone's kind to me, and Fenrir lets me pet him, and the cook makes honey cakes just for me. Children adapt quickly to new circumstances," Ingrid said dismissively. "You'll make friends in your new home just as easily." "What if he doesn't want to adapt?" Ragnar asked quietly. "What if none of them want the future you've arranged?" Ingrid's back stiffened. "With respect, Your Majesty, these are family matters. A mother must make practical decisions for her children's welfare, even when those decisions are difficult. Even when those decisions ignore the children's own wishes and capabilities." Ragnar's voice carried a dangerous edge now. "Even when they sacrifice individual happiness for social convenience. Happiness is a luxury few can afford," Ingrid replied coldly. "Security and respectability matter more than romantic fantasies." Astrid rose from her chair slowly, her injured arm aching but her spine straight with newfound resolve. "You're right about one thing, Mother. This is a family matter, which means Eric and I deserve voices in decisions that affect our lives. You're 22 years old with no prospects and no inheritance," Ingrid snapped, her careful composure finally cracking. "What voice could you possibly have in arrangements that benefit everyone involved?" "The voice of someone who has proven her worth through actions rather than bloodlines," Ragnar said firmly, rising to his full impressive height. "The voice of someone who risked her life to save family members who show her no gratitude or respect." The king's intervention seemed to surprise Ingrid, who had clearly expected him to remain neutral in what she considered a private family dispute. "Your Majesty, surely you understand that gratitude doesn't change practical realities. Astrid's size and appearance limit her options significantly. Do they?" Ragnar asked softly. "Or do your prejudices limit your ability to see other possibilities?" Before Ingrid could respond, he turned to address Astrid directly. "I have a proposition of my own to offer. One that doesn't require you to accept marriage to strangers, or exile yourself from the home you've come to know. Astrid's heart began beating faster, though she tried to control her expression. What kind of proposition, Your Majesty? I need someone to oversee the new healing centers I'm establishing throughout the kingdom, Ragnar explained. Someone with extensive knowledge of herbal medicines. Someone who understands both noble and common perspectives. Someone brave enough to travel to remote locations where help is needed most. The offer was so unexpected that Astrid could only stare at him in amazement. You would trust me with such responsibility? I would trust you with my life, Ragnar replied simply. You've already proven your courage, your intelligence, and your compassion. The position comes with its own lands, its own income, and complete independence from anyone else's decisions about your future. Eric jumped up from his stool, excitement radiating from his small frame. Does that mean we could stay here? That I could keep visiting Fenrir and learning about sword fighting from Captain Bjorn? If that's what you choose, Ragnar confirmed. But the decision belongs to each of you individually. Ingrid's face had gone white with shock, and something that looked suspiciously like envy. This is preposterous. Astrid has no training in administration, no experience managing large projects. She has something more valuable than formal training, Ragnar interrupted. She has wisdom earned through hardship, and a heart that puts others' welfare before her own comfort. Astrid found herself caught between overwhelming gratitude and deep uncertainty. The offer represented everything she had never dared dream of. Independence, purpose, respect from others. But accepting it would mean defying her mother openly, choosing her own path regardless of family expectations. She began, then stopped as the magnitude of the decision overwhelmed her. You don't have to answer immediately, Ragnar said gently. Take time to consider what you truly want, not what others expect of you. I already know what I want, Eric declared with 8-year-old certainty. I want to stay with Astrid. She's the only one who really takes care of me. The simple statement cut through Ingrid's composure like a blade. For a moment, her face showed genuine pain as she realized how completely she had lost her children's affection through years of criticism and emotional distance. Very well, she said finally, her voice brittle with forced dignity. If this is how my sacrifices are repaid, if my own children prefer strangers to family, then perhaps it's better that we part ways. Mother, Astrid began, but Ingrid held up a hand to silence her. No, you've made your choice, both of you. I'll return to Lord Ravenswood alone and accept his proposal on my own behalf. She looked directly at Astrid. But don't come crying to me when reality proves harsher than royal fantasies. With that bitter parting shot, Ingrid swept from the great hall, leaving behind a silence heavy with unspoken emotions. Eric moved closer to Astrid, slipping his small hand into hers. Did we make the right choice? He asked uncertainly. Astrid looked down at her little brother, then across at King Ragnar, whose ice-blue eyes held patience and understanding rather than pressure or judgment. For the first time in her 22 years, she was being offered the chance to choose her own destiny based on her own worth rather than others' convenience. Yes, she said softly, feeling strength flow through her like warm honey. I think we did. Outside the great hall's windows, snow began falling again. But instead of bringing the chill of isolation, it seemed to promise the clean freshness of new beginnings. Whatever challenges lay ahead, Astrid would face them as herself, not as her mother's disappointing daughter or some stranger's reluctant bride, but as a woman whose value had been recognized by someone whose opinion truly mattered. The future stretched before her like an unwritten page, full of possibilities she was only beginning to imagine. Chapter 8. Crown of Iron and Heart. The great hall of Ironhold had been transformed into something from the old legends. Ancient banners hung from the vaulted ceiling, their rich colors brilliant against stone walls lit by hundreds of candles. The air hummed with anticipation, as nobles, warriors, and common folk alike gathered to witness an event that would be spoken of for generations. Today, their king would take a bride. Not the political alliance many had expected, but a love match that had shocked the entire kingdom. Astrid stood in the chamber that had been prepared for her, gazing at her reflection in a polished bronze mirror that seemed to show a stranger. The wedding gown was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, deep blue silk that brought out the green of her eyes, embroidered with silver thread in patterns that caught the light like captured starlight. The seamstresses had created something that celebrated her natural figure rather than trying to disguise it. And for perhaps the first time in her life, Astrid felt truly beautiful. "You look like a queen," Eric said softly from where he sat on a nearby chest, his own ceremonial clothes making him appear older than his 8 years. Father would be so proud. Astrid turned from the mirror, her heart full of emotions she could barely contain. 6 months had passed since Ragnar's formal proposal. 6 months of learning to see herself through his eyes, of discovering that her worth had never been in question except in her own mind. The king had courted her with the patience of a man who knew exactly what treasure he sought, never pushing, always respecting her need to believe in her own value. "Are you ready?" asked Lady Meredith, the elderly woman who had served as Astrid's advisor in matters of court protocol. "The ceremony will begin shortly." Before Astrid could answer, a soft knock at the door announced another visitor. To her surprise, her mother entered the chamber, dressed in fine clothes, but looking older than her 45 years. Ingrid's marriage to Lord Ravenswood had lasted barely 3 months before ending in mutual disgust, leaving her dependent on Ragnar's charity for a place to live. "Mother," Astrid said carefully, uncertain of Ingrid's purpose here, "I wasn't sure you would come." "I nearly didn't," Ingrid admitted, her voice lacking its usual sharp edge. "But I realized there were things that needed to be said before you take this final step." The two women looked at each other across the chamber, years of hurt and misunderstanding stretching between them like a chasm. Eric watched with the grave attention of a child who sensed important adult emotions at work. "I owe you an apology," Ingrid said finally, the words coming with obvious difficulty. "More than an apology. I owe you acknowledgement of truths I've spent years denying." Astrid felt tears prick her eyes but said nothing, allowing her mother to continue at her own pace. "When you were born, you were so different from what I expected," Ingrid went on, her voice growing stronger. "I had dreamed of a daughter who would be everything I wasn't, graceful, slender, admired by all who saw her. When reality didn't match my fantasies, I blamed you instead of examining my own shallow expectations." "Mother, let me finish," Ingrid interrupted gently. "I spent 22 years making you feel inadequate because I couldn't accept that my vision was flawed, not you. I watched your father love you unconditionally and resented it, thinking he was being foolishly indulgent." Her voice cracked slightly. "It wasn't until I saw how others responded to your courage, your intelligence, your compassion, that I began to understand what both he and the king saw so clearly." Astrid moved closer to her mother, seeing genuine remorse in the pale eyes that had shown her so little warmth over the years. "You weren't entirely wrong," she said quietly. "I am different from other women, and that difference has consequences." "Yes, you are different," Ingrid agreed. "You're stronger, braver, and more worthy of respect than any conventional beauty I've ever known. The king sees that. The entire kingdom sees it now. I was the only one too blind to recognize my daughter's true worth." Before Astrid could respond, Eric slipped from his perch and approached them both. "Does this mean we can be a real family again?" he asked hopefully. "Like when father was alive?" Ingrid knelt to his level, tears flowing freely down her cheeks. "I don't know if I can ever make up for the damage I've done," she said honestly, "but if you'll both allow it, I'd like to try." The embrace that followed was tentative at first, then growing stronger as years of pain began to heal. Astrid felt a weight she hadn't even realized she was carrying lift from her shoulders. She had never needed her mother's approval to know her own worth, but having it felt like a gift she had never expected to receive. "Your Majesty approaches," Lady Meredith announced from the doorway, having returned from some errand. "The ceremony is about to begin." Astrid took a deep breath, smoothing her hands over the silk of her gown. In moments, she would walk into the great hall and pledge her life to a man who had seen past every insecurity, every doubt, every cruel word she had ever heard about herself. The girl who had hidden at her father's funeral was gone, replaced by a woman who knew her own value. The great hall fell silent as the massive doors opened. Astrid stepped into the space on Eric's arm. The boy had insisted on the honor of giving his sister away, since their father could not. The assembled crowd rose as one, their faces showing not the skepticism she had feared, but genuine joy for their king's happiness. Ragnar waited at the altar, magnificent in royal blue and silver that matched her gown. At 29, he commanded the space simply by existing in it. But his ice-blue eyes held only warmth as they found hers across the distance. Beside him, Fenrir sat with regal dignity, the Grey Wolf's amber gaze seeming to approve of the proceedings. As Astrid walked the length of the hall, she passed faces that had become familiar during her months at court. Servants who had shown her kindness, guards who had come to respect her practical wisdom, nobles who had learned to value substance over appearance. These people had become her community, her chosen family beyond blood relations. When she reached the altar, Ragnar stepped forward to take her hand. His touch was warm and steady, exactly as it had been during their first meeting in the snow-covered valley where he had saved her life. "You are beautiful," he murmured, his voice pitched for her ears alone. "More beautiful than any queen who ever wore a crown." The priest began the ancient words that would bind them together, but Astrid barely heard the formal ceremony. Her attention was focused on the man beside her, the king who had seen her worth when she couldn't see it herself, who had offered her not just love but respect, not just protection, but partnership. "Do you, Ragnar Ironwolf, take this woman to be your queen, to stand beside you in all things, to share your burdens and your joys until death parts you?" "I do," Ragnar replied, his voice carrying clearly through the hall. "With all my heart and soul, I do." "And do you, Astrid Bjornsdottir, take this man to be your king, to stand beside him in all things, to share his burdens and his joys until death parts you?" Astrid looked into Ragnar's eyes and saw not just love, but complete acceptance of who she was and who she could become. "I do," she said firmly. "With all my heart and soul, I do." The priest raised his hands for the final blessing. "By the power vested in me by the old gods and the new, I pronounce you husband and wife, king and queen, bound together for all eternity. What the gods have joined, let no mortal put asunder." Ragnar's kiss was gentle but certain, sealing their union before the witnesses who would carry word of this day throughout the kingdom. When they separated, Astrid saw tears of joy in his eyes that matched her own. The celebration that followed was unlike anything Ironhold had ever witnessed. Music filled the air as nobles and commoners alike danced together, the usual barriers of rank forgotten in the joy of their king's happiness. Astrid moved through the festivities like someone in a dream, accepting congratulations from people who genuinely wished her well. "Your Majesty," called Captain Bjorn Ravenshield, approaching with a goblet of wine and a broad smile. "The men wanted me to present you with a gift." He gestured toward a group of warriors who stepped forward carrying an ornate wooden chest. "What is it?" Astrid asked, curious despite her exhaustion. "Open it and see," the captain encouraged. Inside the chest lay a magnificent sword, its blade etched with runes and its hilt wrapped in leather dyed royal blue. But what made Astrid gasp was the inscription along the fuller, "For the queen who saved the king." "We had it made by the finest smith in the kingdom," Bjorn explained. "You proved yourself a warrior at Ravenspeak Fortress. Now you have a weapon worthy of your courage." Tears flowed freely as Astrid lifted the sword, testing its perfect balance. Never in her wildest dreams had she imagined receiving such recognition for actions she had taken simply out of love and desperation. "Thank you," she managed, her voice thick with emotion. "All of you. Thank you for seeing something in me that I never saw in myself." As the evening progressed, Astrid found herself standing on a balcony overlooking the courtyard, taking a moment of quiet reflection amid the ongoing celebration. Ragnar joined her there, slipping an arm around her waist and pulling her close against his powerful frame. "Any regrets?" he asked softly, his breath warm against her ear. "Only that my father couldn't be here to see this day," Astrid replied honestly. "He would have loved knowing that his little blackbird found her wings." "He knows," Ragnar assured her. "Somewhere in the halls of the gods, Bjorn Ironshield is raising a horn of mead to his daughter's triumph." Below them in the courtyard, Eric played with a group of children while Fenrir supervised with the patience of a born guardian. Ingrid sat nearby, her face peaceful in a way Astrid hadn't seen since childhood. The scene represented everything she had ever wanted: family, acceptance, belonging. "What happens now?" she asked, leaning into Ragnar's strength. "Now we rule together," he replied simply. "We protect our people, build a better kingdom, and raise children who will know their worth from the very beginning." His voice grew softer, more intimate. "We love each other without reservation, exactly as we are." 6 months later, as Astrid stood on the same balcony watching the sunrise paint the mountains gold and pink, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. Her hand rested on the gentle swell of her belly, where their first child grew strong and healthy. Eric had thrived in his new life, showing promise as both scholar and warrior. Even Ingrid had found peace, establishing a healing center for women who had suffered abuse or abandonment. The kingdom prospered under their joint rule, with new laws protecting the vulnerable and opportunities for advancement based on merit, rather than birth. Astrid had kept her promise to oversee healing centers throughout the realm, traveling extensively during the early months of their marriage to ensure that help reached even the most remote villages. But perhaps most importantly, she had learned to see herself through loving eyes, not as the fat daughter who was unwanted, but as the strong woman who was cherished exactly as she was. The scars on her arm had faded but never disappeared, serving as permanent reminders of her courage. The girl who had hidden at the edges of her father's funeral had become a queen who commanded respect through wisdom and compassion. Fenrir padded onto the balcony, his gray coat now touched with silver that spoke of advancing age. The wolf settled beside her chair with a contented sigh, amber eyes reflecting the same peace that filled her heart. "Good morning, old friend," Astrid murmured, scratching behind his ears. "Ready for another day of ruling the kingdom?" As if in answer, Ragnar emerged from their chambers, magnificent even in simple sleeping clothes, his hair tousled and his eyes bright with love. He kissed her forehead gently before settling into the chair beside hers. "Any royal proclamations to make this morning, Your Majesty?" he teased, taking her hand in his much larger one. "Just one," Astrid replied, smiling at the man who had taught her to believe in her own worth. "I, Astrid Ironwolf, Queen of the Northern Kingdoms, do hereby proclaim that love has no size limits, beauty comes in all forms, and every soul deserves to be cherished for their true worth." "An excellent proclamation," Ragnar agreed solemnly. "I second the motion." Together, they watched the sun rise over their kingdom, two souls who had found in each other the acceptance and love that transforms even the most wounded heart. The fat daughter, who had been abandoned by her mother, had become the beloved queen, who would never abandon anyone in her care. And in that transformation, both the kingdom and its rulers had found their way to happily ever after. The end.